Welcome to Oil and Gas Law with Energy Law Prof. Today we're going to talk about some more implied covenants to develop. So we talked about the implied covenant to protect against drainage last time, that requirement for the oil and gas company to act as a prudent operator to ensure that oil isn't drained from the lessor's property. But let's talk about some more implied covenants to develop today. So there's several that could be put in this category of implied covenants to drill. One we talked about earlier in the course, which is this implied covenant to test. It's this sort of historical duty. Remember, these are all implied covenants. They're not explicit in the lease, but the courts, early courts in the early days of the oil and gas industry, implied this duty regardless of the length of the primary term for the oil and gas company to at least start drilling to look for oil early in the primary term. And oil and gas companies, of course, didn't like that. They said the whole point of the primary term is that we negotiated for a period of years, maybe up to 10 years, where we don't have to drill until the end of that. And so to avoid that implied covenant to test, they instituted delay rentals, right? This idea that we make an annual payment in lieu of drilling every year. And so as long as we make those annual payments during the primary term, we get to keep it to the end of the primary term without testing, without drilling for oil and gas. But historically, that was an important implied covenant. The implied covenant to develop is another important implied covenant to drill. Now, what that basically says is, imagine that you have a relatively large property. So, imagine that you have 400 acres of property, and let's say that you only need 40 acres to drill for oil. Now, and let's imagine that the oil and gas company drills in that corner of your property. Now, you might think, okay, keep drilling because obviously there's plenty of room for other oil production on my property. But the oil and gas company might say, you know what? Under the lease, under the literal terms of the lease, and this is true under most leases historically, I get to keep that lease as long as oil and gas is produced. So if there's a single producing well, that's enough. And if that well continues producing and paying quantities for 100 years, I get to keep your lease for 100 years, even though I'm really only producing a corner of your property. And so the implied covenant to develop says, you know what? That's not good enough. If you've only drilled a little bit of my property and there's clearly other oil there, you need to drill other wells to produce all the oil that you know is on my property. Okay, the third implied covenant is the implied covenant to explore. And this is in the more speculative circumstance where you have a well or multiple wells that are keeping that lease because there is production in paying quantities. So that means that oil and gas is still produced, but the landowner would like you to look and see if there might be more oil on that lease, maybe in a deeper formation or maybe on an unexplored part of that lease. Okay. The implied covenant to test, we talked about that. That's this idea that the lessee, the oil and gas company, has to drill the premises within a reasonable period of time, even if the negotiated primary term is longer, as much as 10 years. That's been gotten rid of by the delay rental clause and also by paid up leases, as we talked about. So nowadays, you can just, instead of paying delay rentals every year, just say up front, look, we're giving you the bonus up front. We don't want any obligation to drill within that primary term until, if we want to keep the lease, we're going to have to drill at least by the end of that primary term. Okay. Now, that covenant to reasonably develop, that's what we're going to really talk about a lot today. This is the idea that just because you have a single well that holds a lease by production, under the literal terms of the lease, it sounds like they're going to be able to keep this lease as long as oil and gas is produced, potentially almost forever, 100 years, certainly decades. But what the implied covenant to reasonably develop says is, regardless of those literal terms, you have to reasonably and prudently develop this property, even if a single well would eventually drain the whole tract. Now, does that make sense? Let's think about that both from the landowners and from the oil and gas company's perspective. I mean, from the oil and gas company's perspective, if a single well would produce all the oil on the property, eventually, even if it took 60, 70, 80 years to gather all that oil and pump it all out from a single well. That's kind of ideal because then they only have to pay for a single well. Okay, why would a landowner prefer to have multiple wells and get that oil out of the ground a little bit faster? Well, there's two important reasons. One is maybe the landowner just wants more money up front. Of course, maybe the oil and gas company wants more money up front as well, but maybe the landowner has a special need for more money faster. One reason that's completely unique to the landowner is the landowner doesn't care at all how much it costs to drill multiple wells, right? Because all those costs are paid by the oil and gas company, by the lessee, the lessor, the landowner doesn't care how much it costs to drill multiple wells. So from the landowner's perspective, it's all benefit to have more wells to produce that oil and gas faster. And certainly in a circumstance where a single well wouldn't actually drain the whole tract and you would never get oil from big portions of the property, then definitely as a landowner, you're going to want more wells developed. So that's why this implied covenant to reasonably develop is important for the landowner. Okay, so to prove a violation, the lessor, the landowner, has to show, again, that additional wells could be drilled profitably, kind of like in that implied covenant to protect against drainage circumstance that we talked about last time. And the landowner, again, has to show that the lessee has in some way acted unreasonably or imprudently by not developing the property by drilling more wells. So again, that a prudent operator would already have drilled more wells by now. Finally, as in that implied covenant to protect against drainage, the lessor, the landowner, is going to have to show damages. All right, let's look at an implied covenant to reasonably develop case. And I think what we're going to see here is that in some ways, this covenant may not offer quite as much protection as the implied covenant to protect against drainage. This case is on page 385 in your 8th edition textbook. It's a case from the 8th Circuit about Nebraska. Here, the lessee had drilled a producing well in the 1950s and unitized it in 1961. So it has a single well. Remember, when it's unitized, that typically means you're not getting that much production from it anymore. And so it's been unitized since 1961. Here, this case is 1979, almost 2 decades later. Well, in the interim, at some point, the lessors, the landowners got very frustrated and they said, look, if you're not going to develop it, we will lease it to somebody who will. So the lessors issued a top lease to Christensen. Now, what's a top lease? A top lease is a lease to another oil and gas company when your property is already leased by an oil and gas company. The key thing about a top lease is it doesn't go into effect until the previous lease expires. So there's really no interest until the previous lease expires. Now, what's odd here is why has Christensen started drilling if there's still a producing well from this previous oil and gas company? Well, presumably the argument here is that the lessor, the landowner, is saying, you know what, that previous lease expired because you didn't reasonably develop the property. And in fact, the trial court accepts that argument. The trial court says, look, this lessee has left this lease without any development for almost 2 decades. It's reasonable that at some point the lessor, the landowner, lost patience, and so the lease was canceled. In fact, the court says it was canceled at the time of the top lease to Christensen. So Christensen at that point then had a valid lease and was fair for Christensen to go ahead and drill as the valid lessee, the new oil and gas company with the lease on that land. The appellate court here, the 8th Circuit, reverses, and it says, no. What's missing here is the lessors didn't give notice to the lessee that it was failing to reasonably develop the property. Because before they just went ahead and leased to another party and basically said, we're just assuming the lease is no longer valid, they had to go to the lessee, to the oil and gas company, and say, you know what, you're not reasonably developing this property. Unless you do so, we're going to consider this old lease null and void. The dissent, by contrast, says, wait a second, the lessees didn't need notice. I mean, they should have known given that it's been so many years, well over a decade, almost two, since they last really were working to get more production from this property. They should have known they weren't being prudent. They were just speculating, and so they should lose this lease. Okay. Interesting argument from the dissent. Generally, though, courts are going to require notice. So this appellate court decision, the majority here, is what you will mostly get under the covenant, the implied covenant, to reasonably develop. So, question. If you want to make a claim for the implied covenant to reasonably develop, when do you have to give notice, demand to the lessee, the oil and gas company, an opportunity to cure? Basically, when do you need to let your oil and gas company know you consider that they have failed to reasonably develop this property? Well, as we'll see, the answer is basically always you should do this. If you believe your company is not reasonably developing your property, you should pretty much always do this. But you don't necessarily have to, but we'll see the practical reasons that you probably want to. Okay, one. If you're seeking cancellation, that's what the Superior versus Devon case says, is that you're not going to get cancellation unless you have given that oil and gas company a chance to cure its failure to reasonably develop by going ahead and drilling a new well. So you're definitely going to have to give notice if you want to cancel your existing lease. Okay, in theory, you could maybe get damages for the years that they failed to reasonably develop your lease, even if you haven't given them notice, okay? But in practice, it's a little bit hard to make that claim, because if you're claiming damages, you need to show what those damages are. So what are your damages when an oil and gas company fails to timely develop your property? Well, basically what you're saying is, sometime in the past, they should have drilled more wells on my property, and I would have been receiving royalty for some number of years. But the question is, when do those damages start? Because there's no real bright line about when they should have drilled that next well. There's lots of prudent oil and gas companies that, after they drill a first producing well, might wait a while to drill the next one. And there's nothing in the lease, and there's no clear time period about how quickly they should drill another well. So it's hard to say when damages would start. The easiest way to figure out when those damages would start is if you had sent them a letter saying, you have not reasonably developed this property, because that would arguably start the clock on when they should be paying damages for their failure to develop. Because if it's been 5 more years since you sent them that letter, well, then it's pretty easy to claim, look, I should have, at least at this point, if they had just responded to my letter, they would have drilled wells, and those would have been providing me with royalty as well. So it makes it much easier to show damages. Okay, so let's say that you've given them notice. Now you want cancellation of this lease. When can that lease be unconditionally canceled? What we'll see is that sometimes it's hard to get unconditional cancellation. Even if you get a court order saying, yes, they should have reasonably developed, a lot of times what you'll get instead is conditional cancellation, which says, you know what, they really should have drilled a well. If they don't drill a well in the next 60 days, or at least start drilling a well in the next 60 days, we're going to cancel this lease. So really often it's going to have to be pretty bad circumstances, or there's some other equity that pushes you, the court, towards unconditional cancellation. Okay. So let's talk about, so that's the covenant to reasonably develop, but let's talk about damages. What kind of damages can you get for a failure to develop? So one kind of damages that often you would see is lost royalty. Okay, so you say, basically, I sent them a letter 5 years ago saying I wanted you to do more development. If you'd done development at that time, I would have received royalty from the oil that had been produced for those 5 years. So what royalty would I have gotten if you had reasonably and prudently developed the property? Okay, note that there's something a little bit puzzling about that, though, right? Because remember, we're talking about the damages for the failure to develop, not for the covenant to protect against drainage. Remember, the covenant to protect against drainage is kind of straightforward, because it basically said there was oil on my property, now it's not there anymore, so it's gone. With the covenant to further develop, it's a little bit confusing because the oil is still there. So you're still eventually going to get the royalty from production from those additional wells, as long as you've now convinced the oil and gas company, perhaps belatedly, to actually start drilling wells. So another way that you could measure the actual damage you've had is by saying, well, look, I'm eventually going to get those royalties now that you're finally drilling these wells, but you should pay me for the lost interest that I would have received if I had had that royalty earlier, and they could have been earning interest in a bank account or in the market. So the value of that loss of use of royalty for that period, which they didn't reasonably develop. Okay. If, on the other hand, you get that lost royalty, right, where you actually just get the full amount that you would have received, then you might have to give some kind of future credit to the oil and gas company that basically says, okay, I've basically given you the lost royalty for the first 5 years of production from this well. So now when I get actual production from this, you shouldn't really get all that royalty because I've already basically paid it to you in damages. So it can be challenging to calculate damages with these failure to develop claims. Okay. Moving on to the next covenant, that covenant to explore further. Okay, so this is the covenant that basically says the oil and gas company should be exploring for oil and gas even if it doesn't know that there's more on the property. So maybe there's oil in a deeper layer, maybe there's oil somewhere out in a new reservoir that's on a different corner of the property than the one being produced, but the oil and gas company should look for it. Now, that's this idea. Just because you have the lease held by production, because there is literally a producing well, you should still explore the leased premises. This doesn't get much purchase, certainly not in Texas. So, if you're filing a complaint, great thing to add to a complaint along with your implied covenant to protect against drainage, along with your implied covenant to reasonably develop. The challenge with this one is in Texas, basically Judge Williams' view of it, one of the authors of the historic textbooks, and was also an SMU prof and went on to be a DC Circuit judge. His view is, look, this is really part of the implied covenant to develop. And so, like with the implied covenant to develop, you need to show that this exploration would yield a reasonable profit. Well, how do you show that exploration yields a reasonable profit? The whole point of exploration is you don't know if there's oil and gas there yet. And so it's actually very difficult to show that exploration is inherently a profitable activity. Usually you lose money and occasionally you make a lot of money when you find something. So that's a very difficult thing to show. So if you treat it just like as part of that implied covenant to develop, the implied covenant to explore further, is rare that really gives you anything beyond what you would get with those other covenants. Okay, the Myers view is a little bit different, which says, no, in this case, the lessor, the landowner, only needs to show that the lessee should have tested the area for data, right? That basically enough time has passed, you have a single producing well, it's time that you do a little exploration. That would be a wise thing to do. It doesn't have to show that it'd be profitable, it just needs to show that it's something it should have done. Okay. A final covenant that really could be thought sometimes as encompassing many of the other implied covenants, but can require more drilling in certain circumstances or better drilling, is the implied covenant to diligently and properly operate, a prudent operation covenant. So you have to act, you always have to act really as a reasonably prudent operator in the circumstances, right? And we've seen this in a number of contexts, right? We've seen it here in this implied covenant to develop further. We've talked about what would a reasonably prudent operator do with an oil and gas well that's not producing as much, when we talked about what counts as production in paying quantities. But this is also really a catch-all term that can be used in other circumstances. So in your book on page 400, we have this Baldwin versus Kubetz case. It's from California. But basically, we had an operator who was violating all kinds of local requirements, wasn't following industry custom and practice. The implied covenant to operate as a reasonably prudent operator covers those kinds of basically carelessness or negligence by the oil and gas operator. That could also include things like you have to obtain zoning variances if that's what's necessary to drill for oil and gas. In this case, Kubitz also violated an express drilling obligation in the lease. You know, we know sometimes leases can actually say you have to drill so many wells. But this reasonably prudent operator covenant, this diligent and proper operation covenant, can be thought of kind of as a catch-all that really covers any kind of other negligent, careless conduct by the oil and gas operator. So, you know, page 404 in your books, it talks about you can have common claims that are for like property damage. You actually, you know, destroyed something on my property, premature abandonment of a well that could have been profitable, antiquated technology that was, you know, limiting your recovery from this oil and gas well, and so limiting royalty to the landowner, or failure to seek some kind of administrative action that was necessary to keep the well operating, like such as the zoning variances that we mentioned. So that prudent operation covenant can really cover a multiple variety of circumstances that ensures that that oil and gas company does what a reasonably prudent operator would do to maximize production from the lease.